Hello, I'm Kelvin Param. Today I'm delighted to speak with Dr. Chee Soon Juan about his new book, Unbroken: The Power of Resilience, which explores how we can endure adversity, find meaning, and rise stronger. Singapore is a global economic powerhouse, prosperous, efficient, and highly successful. But beneath this veneer of achievement, a growing body of data and an expanding collection of personal accounts suggest a different, more somber reality. Recent studies reveal that many Singaporeans, both young and old, are struggling with mental distress, fueled by a competitive education system and high pressure work culture. In Unbroken, Dr. Chee writes that the weight of adversity tests not only your resolve, but your very identity, your sanity, even. His decades long journey through political and professional setbacks underscores a lesson that extends well beyond politics. Resilience is not about stoicism or denial, but about learning to bend without breaking, to fall without losing heart, and to rise in the face of adversity. What drives the mental challenges in one of the world's most developed nations? How does the relentless pursuit of academic and professional excellence shape psychological well being? And what can we learn from people like Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi, who endured immense suffering and still found meaning and hope? The answers lie partly in systemic change, policies that reduce the corrosive effects of stress and inequality, but also in cultivating inner strength, which comes through practical strategies for caring for the mind and spirit, through moments of grace that appear when we least expect them, and through the shared understanding that we don't have to face our quiet battles alone. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Chee Soon Juan to discuss Unbroken, the power of resilience, and the hard won insights it offers. A PhD in neuropsychology, a former lecturer at the National University of Singapore, and the longtime leader of the Singapore Democratic Party, he brings both personal experience and a deep understanding of resilience. Soon Juan, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Let's begin with the concept of resilience itself. What is your understanding of the term resilience?
Well, in our culture, resilience, the Chinese word there is 忍, and the Malay is tahan. Whatever it is, what you do is you stoically accept the pain and stand erect and make sure that, you don't get buffeted. But resilience is really more than that. It's not just about bouncing back, but it's moving forward, stronger and wiser. And the brain is very equipped to help us do that.
So, what motivated you to write this book, and who is it for?
Right through the years, going through what I had to endure in this political climate, I just found that my own experience and my training in neuropsychology gave me insights into how we could better handle our mental health, our ability to cope with adversity, with setbacks, with tragedy and trauma, in fact. And I just felt that it was just important uh, for me to get these insights across and to be able to tell society, which is undergoing a tremendous amount of mental health issues as well, to be able to provide people with the wherewithal to try to cope and overcome the daily problems that they're experiencing, to the point that mental health has become a crisis here in Singapore. And to whatever extent that helps, I just want to be able to get some of these issues across, have a better understanding of your own mind and body, and to be able to better cope with life's crises.
Well, Sunjuan, let's dive into your book itself by first discussing mental health in children and young people in Singapore. What do the numbers say about the state of mental health amongst children and young people?
Not encouraging, and I'm putting it mildly. Among our children, one in four, 1 in 4 youths are estimated to be affected by disorder mental health. And you have younger Singaporeans experiencing mental health issues so much so that they've contemplated self-harm or suicide at least once. They had to take time off, and many of them are affected by this very exam-oriented education system. And we just had the story break out just a couple of days ago when an 11-year-old boy took his own life. And these are huge issues, they're serious issues that we need to grapple with, confront. And it's just the way I see it. I have children, and to have our youth take their own lives because of life stressors, these are things that we can grapple with and we can uh, come out on top with. So that's the whole idea, just to make sure that we acknowledge this problem here in society and let's try to do something about it.
Besides the education system, the high pressure education system which you alluded to, what other factors contribute to this tragic state of affairs?
Among children, I suppose in this day and age, research again has shown the feeling of isolationism, or just being alone, or being lonely despite the connectivity, with technology. That's another issue that I think researchers should weigh in on more. Mental health professionals should come in a greater way. We are talking about public policy as well, and how we handle our schools, the education system. How much time do we need to have children getting out in the open without their devices? These are all factors that we should begin to look into and get them young, get them early to be able to recognize symptoms, develop habits of making sure that we remain connected, we remain very community based, because these are again factors that aid in helping mental resilience.
And what can parents do to prevent their children from feeling despondent and even despairing?
This whole process that in neuropsychology we call co-regulation, where one individual can have an impact on the, I just don't want to get too technical, but on the central nervous system of another individual. And that brain is able to perceive the other person's, when you exude calm, they borrow that calm. When you radiate tension, anxiety, and even anger, they also absorb these very negative emotions. So, how an adult, be it parent or educator, caregiver, express themselves in our facial tone, what we say, body language, all this impacts on how the younger mind perceives the surrounding. The more emotionally grounded that adult is, the more we create a neurobiological climate where the young mind perceives safety and is able then to learn and to become more emotionally adept at handling adversity in future circumstances. So, when an adult, especially when they're dealing with a younger person, all these things matter in terms of building resilience.
Some children and young people will at some point need professional mental health help. At what point do parents need to refer their children to mental health professionals?
There are indicators, but unlike, say, when we have a fever, anytime you go above a certain temperature, those are warning signals. Unfortunately, in mental health, it's sometimes just an accumulation of issues and behaviors that are not readily apparent. So there is not one numerical indicator there that people can begin to say, aha, you have a problem here. Let's go see a medical doctor. What I think is very lacking in society is this more a pervasive environment where mental health professionals are at the ready to provide service. In schools right now, for example, we need counselors, school psychologists. And I think those are things that, rather than having parents to refer to them, for schools to be able to begin to plan the curriculum such that um, life skills like building up mental resilience, should be built into the program, and to be able to provide the kind of services without children having to go through months and sometimes even years of psychological distress, and find that at the end of the day that they cannot cope with it and take very drastic steps. So this whole idea of stigmatization then comes in. Peoples around the world still feel it tremendously difficult to accept the fact that either they themselves or their children are facing mental problems and need to approach mental health professionals, because then they might then get lumped in together, with certain kinds of labeling, and they avoid that. But in order to preempt that kind of mindset of stigmatization, we should make mental health help readily available and very pervasive across culture.
You mentioned that there is this need to make mental health help pervasive and readily available. In reality, just how accessible are professional mental health services for young people and children, both in the public sector versus the private sector?
If you're talking about private sectors, you're usually talking about, where children already develop certain kinds of anxiety, stress levels that really require professional help. And you've got to take that step into wanting to go and search for usually a therapist and even a psychiatrist. And just the thought of having to approach what we call the IMH, Institute of Mental Health here in Singapore, and you already see when you talk of the IMH in Singapore, it conjures a certain picture of the child having, the typical symptoms of psychological disorders, psychiatric disorders. But what I'm trying to get at is that it should be available in schools where you have weekly periods where you talk about some of these issues of mental health symptoms that students can readily identify, and walk up to any counselor and say, I think I'm going through some of these, and without any kind of labeling, shaming, be able to approach these issues with professionals and be able just to talk openly about it. And I don't think that's right now very prevalent here in Singapore, where mental health professionals are readily available.
Now, let's turn our attention to the adult population of Singapore. On page 67 of your book, you refer to the state of mental health in Singapore as a crisis. Why do you say so?
That's not my word. It was a term used by a study done by Duke, NUS, and the Institute of Mental Health in Singapore's joint study. And they actually mention this as a crisis in other reports. Mental health has become an epidemic in Singapore. Again, not my words, but terms used by the establishment. It is, when you look at the numbers, nearly 50% of Singaporeans say they've experienced depression or feel hopeless, feelings of hopelessness for weeks at a time. 25%, in fact, more than that, I think it's around 27% of them indicated that they've seriously considered self-harm or suicide. So these are not just numbers. They are a crisis where I think if we continue to delay, addressing them in a more meaningful and effective way, I think that's going to be a huge, huge problem for society.
So, what are some of the factors or key factors that lead to poor mental health amongst adults in Singapore?
One thing I believe is really how society then is structured itself. And I'm talking about this constant need to produce more, to consume more, and to be able to deliver all the time. I think that's a huge, even if it's sometimes invisible kind of pressure that we bring to bear on the average employee. These are just things that we need to be very mindful of. And in the workplace, where your leadership, where management continues to drive through very mistaken kinds of notions about a command and control structure where you've got to push, you've got to make them report to you and have meetings after meeting after meeting. And all these things are counterproductive. And I might add, really sometimes add to the productivity loss. Now, in Singapore alone, this Duke NUS IMH study that I just mentioned estimated that productivity loss annually amounted to nearly $16 billion. And that's about 3% of GDP in Singapore. Think about that. That's huge, huge number. And if we continue to not see and begin to have this mindset where more is sometimes less, and we don't get into making sure we deal with these mental health issues, we just are contributing to that loss, and that's a real shame.
You've talked about, the monetary costs of a dysfunctional work culture. On the converse, what kind of work culture will protect the mental health of staff?
Enlightened leadership. And this is where I think the shame is that sometimes our managers are not conscious of the fact that, as I said, driving your staff, driving your subordinates to meet certain goals and to produce a certain level of work, that's counterproductive. And there are many instances where leadership that understand the psychological needs of your subordinates open up a whole new world where productivity, innovation, and just this whole idea of a sense of well-being, psychological well-being, can lead to greater levels of productivity and the kind of culture, organizational culture that corporations keep dreaming of, but never seem to be able to achieve.
Let's return to looking at the mental health of working adults. How accessible are mental health services to the public in both the public and private sectors?
That part of it, I think, in the corporate world, I think management, those in leadership positions, uh, and I believe that there are already corporations that are very in tune with the mental health situation, and they have put aside budgets to be able to engage mental health professionals in coming in and to be able to address some of these issues with their staff. Unfortunately, I don't think it's as widespread as what these corporations should be doing. And I think it's important that we begin to look into this matter more broadly and more in depth as well. But to have in house mental health professionals, I'm not sure how that would work. But there are certainly sectors where mental health professionals can provide services in coming in and providing support, if you will, to their staff and to make sure that they function on an even keel. And we're constantly monitoring the productivity levels, if you will, just to come back into very pragmatic terms, and to make sure that mental health continues to be on the front burner of everything that they do. And so I suppose one way that they could have is just these mental health services provided on a quarterly basis, and just to monitor what goes on among the staff in there, and to be able to for them to seek help without having to again stigmatize themselves by having to go to seek the help of a therapist, and that really creates the problem where these mental health services are not readily available.
You mentioned stigma in this context, and also in the context that there's some organizations, employers who will provide, mental health professionals to help their staff. I'm just wondering how social stigma will factor into decision making of a staff member who's feeling overwhelmed and wanting to seek help of the company assigned mental health professional. Probably running through their minds will be, how will my boss view me? Will they view me as someone who's weak, unable to carry the load? How will my colleagues view me? Just how real is stigmatization in the workplace, and what can and what should be done to change this perception?
Yeah, without having to second guess what your supervisor, your boss thinks of you if you were to reveal the fact that you are having mental health issues. And, it should be the converse, isn't it? Where people feel comfortable in seeking support in terms of just having to go through some of the emotions that they are experiencing, and to have as I keep coming back to this word, enlightened management leadership, to say that, hey, look, that's quite normal in that sense that our human mind, our human brain needs support as much as our body needs support in terms of recreation, in terms of exercise and our nutrition, and to recognize that and to be able to provide that kind of a service without the employee having to second guess. And many times when that culture, organizational culture, isn't there, you run into problems where left to their own devices, they would really begin to say, hey, look, if I were to reveal this to my supervisor, how will he view me? And what does it say about my, uh, chances of getting promoted, making an advancement in my career? And so this self-censorship then begins to set in, and you want to play safe, and you begin to keep all these problems all to yourself and let it fester, and then things begin to degenerate. So instead of having that kind of system, why don't we begin to look into and consider seriously some of these approaches that we can adopt to make sure that, hey, we're open about this, and once mental health issues are not something that we just have to live with and there's nothing we can do to better the situation. Once your staff in the organization get it, you'll find that we can approach this matter openly and create a more healthy environment.
I'm Kelvin Param, here with Dr. Chee Soon Juan, talking about his new book, Unbroken, The Power of Resilience. You can find it now in select bookshops in Singapore and online at unbroken.cheesoonjuan.com. That's unbroken.cheesoonjuan.com. Let's now look at the psychological research behind resilience and its converse, despondency and despair, and poor mental health. What does psychology tell us about the pathways that lead to despondency and even despair?
In psychology, a lot of research has been done to look at issues such as acquiring meaning in what we do. And we found that people who are able to put meaning, to answer the question why, as they're undergoing these difficulties, these hardships, find it easier to endure these hardships. My own personal journey, where I've experienced tremendous difficulties as I was going through my political experience, I found it much easier to cope with these difficulties when I could answer the question, why am I doing this? And this is where I think when people begin to understand the meaning of why they're going through and be able to answer that question, can handle these difficulties a lot better. And many times too, we pick up on, there is this whole process of learned helplessness where we find that anything that happens to us in our environment, that we're unable to control it. And it's that kind of thinking that we acquire that makes it much more difficult for us then to want to change things and determine our own destiny, if you will. So there are techniques that we can begin to pick up on to overcome all these shortcomings that we may have learned through our experiences. And that, I think, is where psychological research comes in.
You mentioned that there are techniques to help us, and that psychological research has also uncovered a lot of these techniques. What does psychological research tell us about the routes out of this soul crushing and debilitating sense of hopelessness.
You know, techniques like, for example, reframing and thinking to ourselves different ways of looking at a situation. A lot of times, just to put in very layman's terms, we tend to see the cup half empty, when in fact, what we can try to develop a mindset and look at it from the point that it is half full. And this whole idea of reframing has just been very effective in showing how we can begin to just reappraise the situation and not let it lead us down the rabbit hole of looking things in a very negative manner. Journaling is another important aspect where we begin to pen, write, physically write down our raw emotions and begin to be able to put it down in words. And sometimes you'd be surprised at how effective these can be in helping us frame some of the things and stepping back and looking at from, I suppose, a different perspective and be able to reevaluate the situation. And then, of course, there are develop a growth mindset. And have been examples of people coming through trauma and very debilitating kinds of experiences, emerging on the other side stronger. But these require, for example, growth mindset. And these just important techniques that I suppose we can begin to learn and practice. And this is where I'm saying it's such a shame that when we don't try to publicize and promote these kinds of skill sets that people can learn and to better themselves and to acquire mental resilience. It's something which is out there that I think should be better, more effectively promoted.
You've talked about practical ways of developing psychological resilience, and that's, I guess, ways of also processing the trauma that a person has undergone. Why is it important to process trauma? What's wrong with suppressing the trauma and just pretending, burying it under the carpet?
You know, our brains work in such a way that sometimes when we are able to just adapt and persevere and learn, through the process of what we call neuroplasticity, the brain can form new neural pathways or strengthen existing ones to help us better cope with our emotions, with our experiences. And over time, for this repeated exposure of adversity, adverse stimuli, you begin to strengthen the brain physically. On the other hand, if we begin to suppress and let these emotions, negative stimuli, then continue to fester and to make these situations unaddressed, then you're talking about having to continue to cope and not be able to have the body, the brain handle such negative experiences. It's going to continue to deteriorate and not strengthen our brains to be able to better cope with the situation. So that's one area that we need to be looking at and to delve more fully and how we can begin to train our brains to better cope with some of these experiences.
In your book, you mention people like Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison for his quest for equal rights for black and colored South Africans, Mahatma Gandhi, who was imprisoned on multiple occasions for leading peaceful protests in the struggle for India's independence, and Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor. Are such people statistical outliers? Or, in other words, do they possess near superhuman ability to endure suffering? Or is there something that ordinary people can learn from them?
You know, I don't see resilience like as if it was a trait with which we are endowed. And if we're not, then we're just doomed to accept our fate and have to go on through in life in misery and not being able to cope with adversity. The reason why I cited some of these more luminous personalities is to be able to learn from them. And how do they do it in their own lives? And are there skill sets that we can acquire to be able to overcome some of our own difficulties in life? And I just found that many of them, as what Viktor Frankl said, if you're able to have the why to live, then you can bear with any how. And that, I think, is a very profound statement that sense that we begin to find meaning. And that's what I think people like Mandela and Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. did in their own lives as they were going through the trials and tribulations, was to find this higher meaning. In terms of Mandela, was just trying to get rid of apartheid in South Africa. Gandhi was fighting for independence in India, and MLK Jr. was just fighting for civil rights and getting rid of segregation laws in America. When they found the meaning in terms of what they were doing, it made enduring the difficulties much easier. They are obviously very unusual characters in a positive way, but I think there are lessons that can be drawn from their own lifestyles, their own psychological makeup, and how they went through. And they've revealed it all in their autobiographies and their memoirs. So I think there are things that we can pick up from there and try to learn from them. And these are things that will help us show up again, as I said, strengthen and buttress our own mental resilience.
Soon Juan, you are no stranger to adversity. What's the most devastating event or chain of events that has happened to you, and how did you find your way out of the psychological abyss?
In the early years, I had joined the opposition, the political opposition, the Singapore Democratic Party when I was just about 30 years old. So it's been a little more than 30 years by now. Uh, in the early years, that was the most trying periods when I was sacked from the National University of Singapore. And when I disputed the dismissal, I was then sued by the officials and ended up having to pay damages to them to the tune of a couple of $100,000. My wife and I had to sell off our car and our house just to make good that payment. And on top of that, I was constantly having to face with a barrage of just attacks by the ruling party. And it was just during the first years of having to go through this that I just found it absolutely traumatic. And then I embarked on this going out and making sure we wanted to create a bigger political space. And as far as speaking in public, free speech laws in Singapore is just very tremendously restricted. So I embarked on this campaign to want to address this free speech uh, restrictions in Singapore, and it ended up in the government conceding and saying that, okay, let's have the speaker's corner at a place where we call the Hong Lim Park. But in going through that process, I was imprisoned on a few occasions, and it was just an accumulation of those experiences that made it tremendously difficult for me in terms of being able to withstand the onslaught of these attacks. And remember, at that time, there was no social media, no TikTok, no WhatsApp for me to push back and defend myself and tell my side of the story. So I was going through a terrible time, and a lot of these attacks had very concrete uh, results, if you will. My dog was poisoned during one of the campaigns, election campaigns. My car was repeatedly, tires were repeatedly slashed. The electrical wiring to my house was cut, and then we had gotten all these phone calls that were very threatening. So it was that period that was tremendously difficult. But, in thinking back, I just had to find the wherewithal, just say, keep breathing, keep believing, keep fighting. And I found it easier to handle these traumatic experiences when I found the reason for at least be able to answer the why and find meaning in what I was doing. And one of the things I kept telling myself was that, hey, there was this bigger thing, more bigger than myself, and that was fighting for justice, for freedom, and democracy in Singapore that kept me going.
How does an ordinary person who's just trying to make their way through life find meaning and purpose in the adversity that they may be going through?
when the average person undergoes his or her storms, and you're talking about maybe it's relationship problems or going through school issues, having work problems, all these are storms that within each person, they are just as significant, they're just as big. And so, just to be able to make sure that you continue to find the meaning to your existence. What am I trying to achieve? What am I trying to do? And is there some meaning to my own existence? And sometimes to be able to spend a bit of time and to go through in our own minds, what are we trying to achieve? And then not be big things like peace, world peace, and justice, but just a little, uh, our own milieu, our own environments, and look at what we're trying to get out of life. That's also, these are considerations that should not be put off offhand. And so just to make sure that we put into context our own situations, and we do find the answers, that's going to be very helpful as we go forward.
The loss of social connection often follows adversities or calamities in our lives. Why is social isolation so damaging?
If we go back into the early humans, when the Homo sapiens started to evolve and come on the scene, we always gathered in groups rather than in solitary existence. And it's that kind of seeking that group to find us communicating, to find solace, and then to be able to develop compassion within our groups that have given rise to communities. And that is why you find that as a punishment, in terms of when you commit a criminal offense, you are then taken to prison. And when you go to prison, it's cutting off from your communication with wider society, your isolation. Our brains are hardwired to seek solace in communities and those around us. And that's why family, friends, our community, all this is hugely important in our daily lives. So that when we begin to experience all these psychological trauma or undergo difficulties in life, the one thing that we should not dispense with is to be able to make connection with those around us. I spoke about co-regulation earlier on, and that interplay of individuals and how it impacts upon our psychological health. The fact that we're able to sometimes be able to talk to each other and reason with each other, to find solace in our words, in our inter-emotional arrangements. All these help in terms of our finding connectivity, our finding connection with each other. And as I said, our brains are very much wired in such a way as to find solace and reassurance and support when we are given the opportunity to interact with those around us.
In your book, you talk about unbroken circles as a means to alleviate social isolation and to maintain social connection. What is an unbroken circle and what's its purpose?
You know, when you're talking about, especially in this time when people all have their mobile devices and left on their own, and they're just doing nothing but zoning out and tuning out to their environments and tragically to others around them, I think that's a problem. And it will continue to be a problem unless we make sure that we break this whole cycle and try to get people to connect more with humans than with machines. And to do that, I think unbroken circles provide that idea, that opportunity for people to come together more physically if we can, but if not, then perhaps just talking to each other online. But whatever it is, I think that human connection is hugely important, where we begin to talk to each other again to find out where our needs are, what our aspirations are, what drives us on. And I think that's something to be said in learning from each other again and creating that whole atmosphere when humans again matter. And well, this whole idea of artificial intelligence and age, of the AI, it can cut both ways. And I think that if handled correctly, I think it will be help then, a hindrance to our daily lives and how we begin to use mental resilience in terms of helping our own issues.
That sounds quite a bit like support groups. Is it significantly different or similar to a support group?
I think, yes, it's similar in the way that we create psychological safety where people can come together and not be labeled just because they're undergoing, certain problems in their lives. And I meant it, in terms of just being able to help society in Singapore, where many times we tend to withdraw from coming together as a society, and especially when we talk about policy and public policy in terms of some of the things that we're experiencing, whether it's financial hardship or, where things are driving us, away from leading healthy lifestyles. Unbroken circles is meant for us to connect with each other again without having to look over our shoulders and saying, are we being watched over? And it's that kind of communication that I hope to bring about. Well, in as far as Singapore is concerned. But if it applies in other jurisdictions and other societies, then let's take it from there and see what we can do with them.
What are some non government organizations or NGOs in Singapore that can offer assistance to those in dire straits?
There are mental health organizations out there that provide services that will help people cope with and, I suppose, pick up on skills that they need. But this field is, as I see it, still relatively unregulated, and where people are not quite sure whether who they approach is going to be effective in helping them with their own situations. What I've just begun to propose is that we need to just talk about this more and be able to bring mental health, mental resilience to the fore, where people are not shy and stigmatization is not a problem. People can openly talk about it and even talk about what drives society to this, uh, to what it is at the moment. We just talked about some of these statistics that are pretty scary and be able to address where's the root cause. Is it from just corporations alone? Is it due to some public policy? Is it due to our educational system? Is it the culture of parents? These are issues that should be talked about openly, debated. Unfortunately, as I've alluded to, this is still not something that's significant or pervasive in Singapore. And that is where I think we should begin in terms of changing our conversation here about mental health in Singapore.
Soon Juan, one of the most refreshing aspects of your book, which sets it apart from many self help titles, is your discussion about the need for systemic changes in society. What do you see are urgently needed policy changes in Singapore and why?
I always think with this analogy, when you're trying to dry the floor and the tap is running, what's the first thing that you do? You mop more furiously, more fervently, or do you really look around you and say, hey, what's the root cause of the problem and turn off the tap first? And this is where I'm trying to get at. I think we have to come back and talk about the economic system, the political economic system that drives society to this extent. And as I see it, and I described in the book, this whole idea of neoliberalism, where just, this globalization of capital and migration and this whole emphasis on cheap labor where we can find them, bring them in. And that is like causing the huge problems that society is faced with, not to mention the destabilizing process that the world is experiencing, in particular in the US and even Europe, where through the decades, you found that wealth is accumulated, accrued more and more to a select few, where the masses then begin to have to struggle to make ends meet. as rich as Singapore is measured by GDP per capita, you still find that 60% of Singaporeans say they're living from paycheck to paycheck. And this is where I find that inequality is going to cause huge, huge problems to mental health. And so there needs to be a relook, a rethink about this global system where people are just constantly driven to produce more and more and to make deadlines, to produce certain amount of goods and services in a reduced time and a reduced capacity. And then again, as I said, the wealth being accrued more and more to a select few. These are things that we need to look at. And that's where I bridge that whole issue of mental health psychology with a bigger look at, a wider look at the political systems, economic systems that are driving the world. And I think we should have a bigger and more serious conversation about this. And this is where I hope to push this whole area of thinking, that we need to look at how we run society, how we manage society. And that, I think, is just one conversation that we should be having.
What you just said may not be top of mind to the ordinary person in Singapore. What would it take for them to see things from that perspective?
I think it's something that we should look at, whether it's through discussions, through debates, through forums, through talking about it in our media. These are things that we can do to raise consciousness in Singapore and to raise the level of public awareness in where are we headed to, or are we going to constantly just cycling on a stationary bike and finding that we have to pedal harder and harder, but essentially going nowhere. These are conversations I said that we need to have. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening at the moment in Singapore. And perhaps this book might be a conversation starter in terms of how we approach this subject. And perhaps maybe even this session with you might help to raise consciousness and begin a conversation that we need to have.
And finally, Dr. Chee, you've been in opposition politics for more than 30 years. Why do you stay the course after decades of not succeeding at the ballot box? And what keeps you rising to your feet each time you're knocked down?
That's a very interesting question. And I'm just grappling with how to, in my own mind, why I do what I do. And for such a long time, I used to measure success in terms of whether I can be successful at the ballot box, that is, get into parliament. But when you look at the sophistication of the system, of the ruling party in terms of the political manipulation, with the control of the media, the way that the election system is, which is far from being democratic, you find that getting into parliament is what the opposition, the political opposition, has been facing for the last 60 years since independence. And I've come to measure success, political success, not by getting into parliament, but really looking at how we can reform the system to make it more open, more transparent, more democratic. And this is where I think that entire motivation, for me at least, is coming from. And I think it's to get at the fundamentals. I mentioned about getting to the root cause of the problem, to look at where the problem emanates. And if I have to turn off the tap rather than feverishly just trying to mop the floor while the tap is running, then I think that's a wiser, smarter thing to do. So this is, I think, where I am at this stage, and to ensure that then I persuade and convince younger generation of Singaporeans to see it from this vantage and to work for the longer term. There is a phenomenon that we call it delayed gratification in psychology, where sometimes we put off immediate things that will reward us and think of where sometimes we need to take a longer view. And as long as we're able to see it from that point of view, I think we will continue to move in the right direction rather than just trying to piecemeal find things that can assuage our own wants and needs and then not be able to achieve the longer term of bringing democracy to Singapore. I think that viewpoint, that ability to delay gratification and build for the longer term, for the future, I think is what's needed in Singapore at this moment.
Soon Juan, thank you for taking the time to discuss your new book, Unbroken, The Power of Resilience, with me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Kevin.
That was Dr. Chee Soon Juan discussing his new book, Unbroken, The Power of Resilience, available now in select bookshops in Singapore and online at unbroken.cheesoonjuan.com. That's unbroken.cheesoonjuan.com. Dr. Chee is the leader of the Singapore Democratic Party and former psychology lecturer at the National University of Singapore. This conversation was recorded on the 1st of October 2025. I'm Kelvin Param. Thanks for listening.